Non-violent action. Neither a passive acceptance of oppression nor a violent opposition to it, non-violent action is an active commitment to utilizing non-violent means to resist violent forces in order to bring about some change. It is a means of challenging problems of dictatorship, genocide, war, exploitation, and systems of oppression. So to start off, I'm going to introduce my media item. I have chosen this image from Gandhi's Salt March of 1930. The photo is taken from one of the most historically important events in the history of nonviolent action and protest, and it represents far more than what meets the eye. One of, if not the most prominent figure in the history of peaceful protests was Gandhi, and Gene Sharp's theory, which I'll be discussing throughout this video, draws largely on the inspiration and principles behind his thinking. The campaigns he led in South Africa and India were grounded by a commitment to non-violence and respect for other human beings, no matter what values divided them. He was focused on challenging structures of power through peaceful resistance in a time when India was rigidly divided by colour, class, sex, and religion. The pinnacle of Gandhi's success as a pioneer of social change was the Salt March of 1930, a 24-day protest march to the Arabian Sea in defiance of the British Salt Act that prohibited Indians from collecting or selling salt. It imposed both a salt tax and a monopoly on manufacturing. The act evolved into a symbol of resistance to British rule in India and built huge momentum. By the time he reached the ocean, he was leading a pack of tens of thousands of followers. 600,000 people were arrested following the Salt March, including Gandhi himself, as they followed his lead in defying the British law by picking up natural salt from the mud. Despite this, his act was effective in promoting national awareness and forged a new discourse about issues that had not previously been discussed or challenged publicly. While nonviolent protest existed long before Gandhi's time, this certainly marked a turning point in the history of its use. India's independence was not granted until 1947, but people were inspired by his efforts and began to realize the power it had to band people together and to present a resisting force without turning to violence or war. Renowned theorist Gene Sharp, who, as I mentioned before, was highly influenced by the work of Gandhi and the example that he led, contributed greatly to the theory on nonviolent action, and his work is crucial to understanding the practices, dynamics, and possible outcomes of peaceful protest. He says that the power in its technique is the ability it has to undermine or expose the weaknesses of a higher force by demonstrating opposition. The stability of a higher individual or group relies upon the cooperation of the population and the institutions of the societies they rule. The source of their power is in the submission and obedience of their subjects, and if the subjects upset that order, the power will shift. As most people realize the injustices of the higher power, the more they support or join the protesters in their action, and thus the more effective it will be in putting a stop to the mistreatment. Sharp situates 200 or so different methods of nonviolent action into three main categories. The first is nonviolent protest and persuasion. This kind of protest is used to bring a certain cause to the public's attention. This might include parades, pickets, posters, education forums, naked protest, and protest meetings. The second method he talks about is non-cooperation, meaning to remove oneself from cooperation or relations with a disagreeable activity or institution, a defiance of existing structures or relationships in society. This is the most broad category that Sharp outlines and might be carried out in the form of a strike, boycott, or civil disobedience. And the third method used to undermine systems of power is non-violent intervention, aimed to disrupt or disconstruct established institutions, beliefs, or policies. This involves non-violent obstruction or blockades, sit-ins, or fastings. If we fast forward about 80 years on from Gandhi's Salt March, non-violent action is still a very popular and powerful tactic of resistance against political regimes as well as other oppressive structures rooted in unequal social and cultural conditions, like patriarchy, capitalism, or racial hierarchies. When 18-year-old Michael Brown, an unarmed black man from Ferguson in St. Louis, Missouri, was shot and killed by Darren Wilson, a white police officer, on the 9th of August 2014, the town erupted in mourning and anger, followed not long by the rest of the country, the world. His story spread like wildfire through the media and all over the internet, and it wasn't long before the whole world knew about Michael Brown and the serving of injustice that led to his death at the hands of the police officer.
It's been a day and night of protests in D.C.
The anger has not subsided at all. We have not received any justice.
The fight is no longer in Ferguson.
Protesters rallied outside the Justice Department calling for federal civil rights action against Officer Darren Wilson.
Don't shoot! Hey! Ho, ho! These are the cops, they got to go! Can't stop the revolution! Can't stop the revolution! Can't stop the revolution! Can't stop the revolution! Let us march! 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 No justice, no peace! Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
Grand jury decided not to indict Darren Wilson, who shot Brown not once but 6 times. He claimed his actions were in self-defense. Protesters took to the streets across the country. The shooting was an undoubted tragedy, but a recurring narrative in America's history. On Black Friday, around 150 demonstrators staged a massive lie-in, or die-in as they called it, at Chesterfield Mall in Missouri, shutting down business operations, and similar strategies of action were taken in the St. Louis area, where protesters boycotted retail stores Walmart and Target, while others took to the streets in D.C., blocking off traffic on major roads for hours. In an article written for the Negotiation Journal of 2008, Finnegan and Hackley discussed nonviolent action as a negotiation strategy employed to engage and interact constructively with conflict, reflecting on Sharp's work. In places where the impact of dictatorship, terrorism, and war are so devastating, nonviolent action may seem ineffective against the forces, but there are many positive effects of nonviolent action if the right approach is taken. One element is the framing techniques used by the activists to gain media attention, build support from external audiences, and influence others to assist efforts. Symbolism is also mentioned as a critical element of nonviolent action. In both the cases of Gandhi's Salt March and the die-in protests in D.C. and Missouri that followed the grand jury's decision not to indict Darren Wilson, the police officer who fatally shot Michael Brown in 2014, symbolic references to their respective causes strengthened the meaning and purpose of their protest and promoted empathy, sparking widespread debate and conversation. The most obvious distinction between the nonviolent protests of Gandhi and his followers and the protests in the US following the shooting of Michael Brown is the role technology played in the spread and reach of the message. In the latter case, not only did it help activists to communicate and organize to gather in larger numbers, protesters were able to upload live contents from the boycotts, the marches, the sit-ins onto social media sites like Twitter and rally support for their cause across the globe.
Traditional news networks on the ground in Ferguson have been able to provide some critical information to the public. But it's social media that's taken a front seat in both getting the information out and helping to organize the resistance of the protesters and demonstrators. In the aftermath of Brown's shooting, we've seen everything from witnesses to citizen journalists to world observers taking to social media in order to find and share the story.
The images from the nonviolent protests grew into something bigger than the actual events themselves could ever be. Global trending hashtags, Black Lives Matter and Shut It Down, produced images and videos of the protests and saturated news feeds, essentially starting a revolution online. Research on the future of nonviolent action and its interaction with the online sphere at this time is limited, as we only are now in an age realizing the power it has to create change and connect people. But through looking at the examples of nonviolent action from the past through to more recent times, we can see that it can be a far more valuable and constructive tactic than retaliation and violence. As Gandhi himself said, nonviolence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It is mightier than the mightiest weapons of destruction devised by the ingenuity of men. It will be interesting to see how we experiment with new technologies in peaceful protests as we evolve into this new age.